Welcome back, everybody. My name is Miri Rubin. I'm a medieval historian. I'm a great fan of Yossi. So I think that's why I'm here, my wonderful colleague. And I consider Hugh to be one of the people who really has created most bridges between Europeanists and non-Europeanists who study our century. The century is known as medieval. So I'm delighted to be here. I've learned so much already today. And I'm just constantly processing the many insights of the book for my own, for the culture, the religious cultures that I normally study, which are medieval Christianity and Judaism, and they are aplenty. But I'm not giving a lecture here today, maybe sometime in the future. What I do have a little story though. A few months ago, I think at the end of 2016, I was on a Skype conversation with my dear colleague and friend, David Nierenberg in Chicago. And he's a dean, he has this vast office, so even on Skype you could see it was like really impressive. And it's a very impressive institution in general in that way. And he had a table for admin, and he had a table for like when he does his scholarship. And I could see there was this book there he was dying to get back to, and it was indeed exactly that book, and he was just, he could not put it down. It was a book that he said it's the best thing he's read in a very, very long time. And David reads a lot, and he's very smart. So I'm just, and he needed occasion to express some of what he thought, and he wrote that long, reflective piece, and I'm sure it's influencing his own work, as it is so many of, as it will the work of so many of us here. I'll just start, Hugh Kennedy is extremely well-known, professor at SOAS, of course, and since the session is called Wine, Art and Science, I take it you're wine. I take it, in Baghdad, court culture, you're wine, because Emily must be science and Noor must be art. So there you are, you live up to that. Well, of course, you don't have to do anything more than you've done already, which is a series of absolutely fantastic books, particularly about how a political system of rule works, an Islamic system of rule works, in many, many books that you all know. And Hugh Kennedy is also running a project which hasn't yet, I don't think, come to fruition, or has it? The one about economic integration, which is so interesting as well.
We've had two, there are going to be 3 conferences, we've had 2 of them, or workshops, they're more like.
Well, that's a considerable responsibility as well. So thank you for being here, and you have about 15 minutes to speak.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to the organisers. I don't know why somebody's idea was that I should talk about wine, but I'm not averse to doing that. And I think it's quite interesting compared with some of the issues we've been tackling and some of the discussions we've been having. The issue of wine is at once rather more simple and straightforward than the paradoxes or the apparent contradictions in attitudes to wine drinking are more apparent than they are in some of the more esoteric subjects that we've been dealing with earlier in this session. At the same time, the whole discussion is a sort of nutshell of Ahmad's arguments. I think it brings together in quite a short section of the book, it brings together a number of the most important arguments he's making. So I'll try and say a few words about this, but let's start off by visiting an Islamic wine drinking party, one that in fact Ahmad doesn't comment on, but would certainly have been aware of, and it's a description of the court of the second of the Ghaznavid Sultans, Mas'ud. It comes in the great Tarikh-i Mas'udi of Bayhaqi, one of the great medieval chronicles, not just the Middle East, but anywhere, which has fortunately for people like me, whose Persian is not as good as it should be, been translated in the last couple of years by the late, much lamented Edmund Bosworth into English. So that it runs to about 1,000 printed pages, so an English version is of great help to those, as I say, whose Persian is not as good as it should be. So here is the Emir Mas'ud, deciding to have a drinking party. We should remember that Mas'ud runs a very Muslim court. He's a champion of Islam. He leads the Muslim armies down into India, not as successfully as his father had done, the great Mahmud of Ghazna, but with some style and panache. He claims also to be the defender of Sunni Orthodox Islam against the people who are referred as heretics, so the Rafidi's, above all the Ismailis. So his regime sets a lot of store on its Islamic credentials. And as a leader of the Muslim, of the eastern part of the Islamic world, the protector of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad, and there's a lot in the book about that, and the messengers of the caliphs and so on. So, and the person who's writing Abu Fazl Bayhaqi is, again, a pious Muslim of unimpeachable credentials. And so I think it's important to remember when we're listening to what's going on that this is the court background that it's happening in. After their departure, the Emir said to Abdul Razak, "What do you say? How about drinking a few large bumpers of wine?" The word that it's one of the great pleasures of Bosworth's translation. He imaginatively, the English word bumper is out of date, but basically be a big goblet of wine. The Persian word is pilpai, an elephant's foot of wine. That's it's so expensive. If you want a really big drink, you have an elephant's foot. Anyway. And said, "We'll set out with them without any pomp and ceremony and drink in the Firuzi garden." Much wine was immediately brought. He left the review ground for the garden, and 50 huge goblets and 2-handled flagons were set down in the midst of the summer house, and the goblets began to circulate. The Amir, that is Masoud, said, "Be fair and keep the bumpers evenly topped up, so that no injustice is done." And they were passed round with each bumper holding half a man, that's a considerable quantity of wine. The merrymaking got underway, and the singers and musicians struck up. Abul Hassan, who's the vizier, drank 5 bumpers. At the 6th, he could no longer take it. At the 7th bumper, he lost his wits. At the 8th, he vomited the lot, and the attendants carried him away. Abul Allah, the physician, fell forward in a stupor at the 5th bumper and was carried out. Khalil, son of Dawood, drank 10, and Siab Buruj 9. Both were carried away to the streets of the Daylamites. Abu Nuaym drank 12 and beat a quick retreat. Dawood Mani fell down drunk. The singers and musicians and jesters all became drunk and took to their heels. There remained only the Sultan, who was Masoud, and Khaja Abdul Razak, who was the man. The Khaja drank 18 and took his formal leave, saying to the Emir, "This is enough for me. A drop more and my manners and my wits will desert me." The Emir laughed and gave him permission to leave. He got up and left with great display of politeness and composure. After this, the Emir kept on drinking happily, and 27 bumpers, each of half a man, were finished off. He arose, called for water and a washing bowl and a prayer rug, rinsed out his mouth, and performed the midday worship. This seems to be a morning session, you understand, and the afternoon worship. And he looked and behaved as if he had not had a drop. I, Abul Fazl, witnessed this with my own eyes. The Emir mounted his elephant and went back to the palace. So this is how they spent their morning. Note some features about this discussion. There's no of course, you didn't disapprove of what the Emir did because you don't do that. But there's no element of censure or doubt about this sort of behaviour. Getting drunk is a very important part of the performance here. These people are carried away legless. I mean, it's there. And again, but there are judgments here, and the Amir is supreme because he can drink all his courtiers under the table, and he can still go and say his prayers in perfect composure at the end of this debauch that's been conducted here. And somehow this anecdote, I think, sums up a lot of the paradoxes of wine drinking that Ahmed is talking about here. This idea that the apparent contradiction between this ostensibly, well, in fact genuinely very Muslim court here and what is going on here, and how are we to reconcile these things. There are judgments made in the course of the Islamic literature, and a lot of the discussion is about moderation and being able to hold your drink. It's not necessarily good to fall over and throw up in the middle of a party. Take this, and this is something that does come from Shahab's book about from Nasruddin Tusi, writing in the 1270s, 1260s, 1270s, about how you should conduct yourself at a drinking party. When one enters a wine gathering, in no case may one stay so long as to become drunk. If a man have a poor head for wine, he should drink little, or he should dilute it, or he should leave the party earlier. Let him not become involved in the conversation of drunken men, or busy himself in mediation between them. However, when matters eventuate in hostility, he should restrain them from attacking each other. Should he feel sick, let him fight it off in the midst of the assembly in such a way that his companions do not become aware thereof, or let him go outside without delay. Once he has vomited, he may return to the party. It's all about conducting yourself in a dignified way in these circumstances. So what does discussion about Ahmad presents it as a paradox, basically, but he makes a fundamental point that it is very much part of numerous Muslim cultures, and here it feeds into two more general ideas that come across in Ahmad's book. And one of them that we've been talking about quite a lot is this Balkans to Bengal paradigm. This is a phenomenon that the courts all the way from Istanbul to Bengal, it's a feature of court life. It's something that is celebrated. It was celebrated in some times in the Abbasi court. We find it particularly in the Turkish-speaking courts of later medieval and early modern period, all the way from the Ottomans to the Mughals in India, as we've seen again. So that's one thing, that this sort of behaviour is characteristic of this Balkans to Bengal axis there. The second point that Ahmed makes and introduces is the fact that these people are not judging themselves by a normative classical Islam. They're not looking back to Salaf. They are inventing and generating a Muslim culture that is not particularly respectful of the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab or the families of the Sahaba of Prophet Muhammad or anything like that. They've developed an alternative model, should we say, of being Muslim rulers. And giving good drinking parties is an essential part of royal behaviour. This is what great kings do. And it's taken very much as part of their royal performance. And I think, as such, it just feeds into the whole argument that Ahmad is producing about diversity of Islamic behaviour. That the argument is central. This sort of drinking party is a thoroughly Islamic way to behave. It may not be the only Islamic way to behave, but it's a fundamentally Islamic way. It's part of Islamic court culture. And it passes without criticism. I mean, I think Bayhaqi's probably writing up that account a bit for comic effect as well, but it passes without censure and that's how the Emir finishes up, by praying in a dignified way after this sort of thing. I think how are we to explain this, I think, is partly because this is, as it were, the whole argument of the book. There are lots of different sorts of ways of being Islamic or being a Muslim, which runs through, as I understand it, a lot of what Ahmed is talking about. And this is a very clear and graphic example of this. But there's also a question of contradiction, isn't there? Apparent contradiction between, as it were, the fake view of alcohol drinking and what's going on here. And I think it's probably perhaps a feature of all monotheistic religions, this apparent paradox. Take this, and Ahmad, as we've already discussed, doesn't look much at Christian parallels and so on. But it strikes me, take this parallel. In the recorded works of Christ, as reported in the New Testament, there is one thing that goes through and through, and by far the commonest theme, apart from believing in Christ as the Son of God, is that you should sell all your possessions and give them to the poor. Absolutely explicit. If you want to follow me, that's what you do. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of the needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. The New Testament is absolutely explicit that if you're a wealthy person, you should get rid of your wealth, give it to your poor, give it to the poor, and follow you. Do Christians do this? Excuse me? Do those? Do I? Do those rich Republican Bible Belt supporters? Do we see them doing that? No, they get extremely agitated about issues like the issue of same-sex love, about which the New Testament and the words of Christ have nothing to say whatsoever, becomes a major item in their religious observance and their religious performance. But all these words about selling what you have and giving to the poor, is it that they don't hear them? Is it that they don't think they're relevant to them for some reason? Is it because they think it's sort of metaphorical? I don't know. I don't understand. But I think it comes back and helps us to understand that people can believe apparently and completely incompatible things at the same time and not find that to be a strain on their performance, or on the way they behave, or on the way they view themselves as good, upright, God-fearing citizens. And perhaps this sort of Christian parallel gives a little bit of an insight as to how these apparently incompatible and irreconcilable views of an issue like wine drinking can come to be. So I'm not going to carry on in this vein anymore. As I said, that wine drinking is in a sense, one of the simpler and more straightforward and clearer examples that Ahmad produces. Another one, we touched on this before, that he might, I think, have gone into, is the question of same-sex love and the same celebration that goes right through the Balkans to Bengal culture, the celebration of the older man's love for the adolescent boy. Absolutely, the culture is suffused with it. And again, and it's considered to be an ennobling experience, at least for the older man. We don't hear much about the young boy's view of it. But for the older man, it's considered to be the pain that the young lover inflicts on you is a source of ennoblement. It makes you a better person. It makes you a part of the whole emotional community that believes that these things are a good thing to do. And yet, as we know, the fuqaha, or at least some of the Islamic law, are extremely hostile to this sort of behaviour. And I think that's why I think the wine drinking discussion is an interesting one when we're getting to the heart of what Shah Ahmad was doing in this wonderful book. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
So, our next speaker is Emily Sampson, who's professor at Oxford. Emily also is, we have to thank her greatly, not only for her wonderful scholarship as the doyen of the history of medieval Islamic science, and science capaciously, to include, of course, cartography famously, but also her project is the one that brought Yossi to the UK, if I'm not mistaken about your biography. Okay, so that's rather wonderful too. And it's, of course, produced the extraordinary, both digitally available and traditionally available, a book of curiosities. And you're running so many wonderful projects, also bringing literature and medicine together, which I thought very fascinating. So I can't wait to hear you speak, really, Emily. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Yossi, for including me in this. Got a little bit of a sore throat, so my apologies for this. This topic's not going to be as entertaining as the one we just heard about, nor the one that's coming up, I fear. As Shahab Ahmed has amply demonstrated in his really monumental undertaking, The terms Islam and Islamic are so ambiguous and amorphous as to be useless, essentially, as terms of historical explanation. And they become confusing and inappropriate when applied to topics such as art and figural representation that you'll be hearing about. The problem becomes acute when we consider phrases such as Islamic science or the history of Islamic medicine. Now, the comments that will follow are those will be reflections from the standpoint of a professional historian of science, which is a slightly different take on it. Shahab Ahmed, I have to say, appears slightly uncomfortable with the topic of science. Very likely, perhaps, he simply wasn't that interested in the subject, which is actually very understandable. In the first chapter, he provides a surprisingly awkward definition of medicine. He says, I quote, "Medical science is truth," of course truth is italicized, "at which humans arrive not through prophetically revealed text, but through the exercise of rational observation and experimentation." End of quote. Now, this definition is that of a modern thinker, looking back in time, and it reflects what he believed medicine was, or perhaps should have been, on the basis of what he thinks it is today. Experimentation was definitely not a part of medical thinking before the very recent modern period, and medicine was never viewed as an unalterable truth, but rather as a constantly evolving process of finding a workable, if temporary, solution to problems of health. Now, to be fair, Shahab goes on to give Ibn Sina's definition of science, which Shahab translates as the real sciences, ulum haqiqiyya. But in that definition, you will find no mention by Ibn Sina of anything that could be interpreted as experimentation or absolutism. In chapter 6 of What is Islam, that's applications and implications, Shahab devotes approximately 5 pages to science, where he defines it simply there as natural science or the study of nature. Now, the Arabic word for science, ilm, plural ulum, meaning simply knowledge, learning, is often modified by various adjectives. And it includes much of what we would now consider under the umbrella of science, but it also covers fields of learning considered today to be outside the realm of science. The term sanaa, art, craft, was also used interchangeably with ilm for many, if not most, of the practices that we have come to associate with the notion of science. For the purposes of today's discussion, I will define science as the attempt to measure and understand, as far as humanly possible, and that's a very large and important caveat, the physical universe and the structure and function of the human body. Now, perhaps science did not fit fully into Shahab's scheme of viewing Islam as a community of constantly changing contradictions. By defining Islam as a community of continually changing ideas, responding to and characterized by ambiguity and contradictions, and by emphasizing what he called the processual, word I can scarcely say, nature of Islamic society, it would suggest that Shahab was not attracted to modes of thought based on universals. Yet science, however it is defined, involves some universals to which practitioners adhere, either consciously or unconsciously. And all thinkers of the medieval and early modern period, as well as those of the modern contemporary world, took and take for granted certain scientific concepts or universals. And these formed a shared body of knowledge that circulated globally and was accepted by all communities and religious confessions. The universals included mathematics and the properties of numbers and the principles of calculating with them. It includes the Euclidean geometry of lines, angles, circles, and cones. It includes logic itself. although over time various systems of logic evolved. It includes the sphericity of the Earth, a fact recognized by all sailors, travelers, and learned people since antiquity, contrary to the erroneous notion common today that people before the time of Christopher Columbus thought the Earth was flat. And it involves the division of one day and night into 24 hours of 60 minutes each, a concept actually that was derived from the division of the celestial equator and the ecliptic into 360 degrees. Another universally accepted idea prior to the modern period, but one that has not stood up to the test of time, is the notion of a sphere of stars rotating about the spherical Earth, with additional spheres holding the orbits of the 5 planets that are visible to the naked eye. In addition, in the pre-modern period, all scholars practicing astronomy, optics, medicine, even astrology, also employed procedures that typified the Greek science of antiquity and that continue to be used today. That is, observation, experience, later to be interpreted as experimentation, and analogy or analogous reasoning. Now, these methods and underlying assumptions can be seen in the thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Arabic, Persian, and Turkish writings from all time periods concerned with various aspects of what we would today call science. The presence of these universal and underlying assumptions makes problematic, rather obviously, the application of the adjective Islamic with any meaning other than designating that the treatises arose in a particular linguistic or geographical context. There were, of course, treatises written in Arabic and Persian particularly that focused solely upon either cosmology as presented in the Quran or on medical care as advocated in the traditions about the Prophet, the Hadith. The latter were called prophetic medicine, Atib an-Nabawi. Now, such treatises appeared as early as the 9th century. They experienced a revival in the 14th and 15th century, and they're still available in print today throughout the Middle East. And they are almost always referred to by modern writers as Islamic cosmologies or Islamic medicine. Yet even here, the authors assume and utilize many of the scientific concepts that I just outlined, while the prophetic medicine treatises also incorporated the theory of disease that characterized earlier Greek medicine. So even in these instances, the term Islamic may not be appropriate. Most, if not all, the authors of the treatises on topics that we would today call scientific also composed treatises on non-scientific topics, legal matters, philosophy, poetry, music, so on. And they saw no contradiction in doing so. Many of them, as Shahab mentions in his book, actively engaged in both theological and scientific speculation. In chapter 6 of What is Islam, Shahab states, and I quote, "Science, like the secular, is one of the binaries that defines," and he puts in quote, "religion." And he goes on to say, quote again, "Historians of science tend reflexively to use this binary language, distinguishing between religious knowledge and scientific knowledge, where, in the case of Islam, religious knowledge is constituted by the Quran and Hadith, theology and metaphysics, whereas scientific knowledge is represented by the rational sciences, quotes, and the exact sciences," end of quote. Now this, in fact, is not what historians of science are doing or saying these days, at least not general historians of science, who may not necessarily be specialists in, for want of a better term, Islamic science. Regrettably, historians of science, and history in general, have been rather slow to follow the lead of their European counterparts, who have argued for some time for the reevaluation, if not altogether rejection, of the science versus religion conflict paradigm. Recent historians of science have argued, and Shahab would very much have agreed with them, that the apparent conflict or divide between science and religion, or secular versus the religious, is due to European writers of the post-Enlightenment who went on to influence virtually all historiography in the past 200 years. In other words, the conflict model, science versus religion, religion versus revelation, that dominates modern studies of the history of science in the Middle East is more a reflection of the conflict between science and religion that arose in Europe after the so-called Enlightenment than it is of Islamic society itself during the medieval and early modern period. In the 18th century, a conscious move was undertaken in Europe to separate the scientific arts, as they were called, from natural philosophy, thereby allowing a person to work with scientific materials and methods while avoiding the troublesome issues of causality, which were then placed in the domain of natural philosophy. And this resulted in subsequent historians always seeing this conflict or gulf between religion and science. It is now felt, however, by current historians of science, that this conflict paradigm of science versus religion was too simplistic a model to adequately reflect the complex and often very fruitful relationship between the two. Thus, Shahab, who wished to reject a religion versus secular binary, would have been in complete agreement with the majority of current historians of science who now reject the science versus religion conflict model. It is now argued that in virtually all societies, from antiquity to the modern period, from Europe through Africa to Asia to Australia and to the Americas, thinkers grappled with scientific concepts while also at the same time engaging to one degree or another with every other aspect of the society, including religion and philosophy. Now, this leads me to say, however, that I find Shahab's solution to the problem of defining Islam and Islamic, unfortunately, to be unsatisfactory as a working model, though his critiques of earlier scholars and various approaches are indeed very rich and useful. Shahab has defined Islam as a way of being that embraces contradictions. In another place, he says it's a rich complex of often contradictory truth claims put forward by various proponents. He suggests that in Islam, individuals live with and by contradictory statements and ambiguities, both within themselves and in society with others. But in that regard, Islam is surely not unique. A community of continually changing ideas responding to ambiguity and contradiction is precisely how recent historians of science have characterized virtually all societies of any and all religious or devotional beliefs. And it is precisely those characteristics of simultaneous contradictions and ambiguities that have provided the environment for scientific thinking from antiquity to the present day. Shahab does make, in my view, a very important point that in the modern contemporary world, the increasing role of the public sphere, and particularly evident in the social media today, along with the simultaneous decline in the use of metaphor and paradox, has greatly impacted upon Muslim society's ability to deal with contradiction and ambiguity. However, here again, the increasing role of the public sphere in the modern world has impacted upon people of all religious convictions and none, not simply upon the 1/5 of humanity that is Muslim. All of humanity throughout history has been trying to manage its way through and to understand a world, indeed a universe, of ambiguity and contradiction. Shahab has not provided, in my opinion, convincing evidence that such a society is unique to Islam. Even granted that there were, we're left with the problem of what terms are to be used for distinguishing a given idea, artifact, or activity that was developed and produced in a dominantly Muslim environment from those of any other environment. Should we even try to make such a distinction? Should we continue to use the terms Islamic science and Islamic art? Shahab does not suggest terms that we might use to replace Islam and Islamic in these contexts, and perhaps that was never his intention. He does, however, reject earlier suggested terms, such as Islamicat, and that's a rejection I agree with completely, even though I used the term more than 40 years ago in a book title. Looking at the scientific and medical material, and that's all I can speak about, I would suggest a chronological and geographical framework to be the most useful as a basis of historical analysis. That is, noting in every given study specifically what time and what place is under scrutiny. In this, I follow A.I. Sabra, who in his important article, Situating Arabic Science, Locality versus Essence, argued that the historian must always first consider specificity and locality when interpreting the development of science. Of course, a chronological and geographical framework is also fraught with problems. For whose calendrical system do you use? What place names, because they're subject to geopolitical fluctuations. So perhaps there is no perfect solution. Short. Right. That's it.
Much has been said today about the range of languages, the extraordinary linguistic expertise and range that the book is based upon, and I'm rather impressed by Noor's range as well. Noor Sobis Khan now works at the British Library, where she's in charge of digitizing Persian collections, but actually her PhD is about labor and manumission and service.
It's actually a stranger journey than that. I started out as an Orientalist working in Arabic, Persian, Ottoman. I'm now working on the South Asia collections, actually, so Urdu and Bengali.
Excellent.
I know. it's even weirder
so
than
that's
Persian.
very impressive.
It's literally the Balkans to Bengal
and
journey.
You're definitely the art and material culture
Yes, that's
person.
me. I'm art.
And we're all very much looking forward to hearing you. Thank you.
So yes, thank you for that introduction. Yeah, it is quite unlikely that an Ottomanist trained as an Orientalist, really as an Oriental philologist, should now somehow be working with Urdu and running a Bengali digitization project at the British Library, but such is the reality that I find myself in. So when Yossi first asked me to contribute to this workshop, discussing what is Islam from the standpoint of Islamic art history, I was actually already about halfway through the book, and so I had a sense of just how daunting and complex of a task it would be to distill in Ahmedian Islamic aesthetics from this magisterial but very complex and itself contradictory work. But I was very happy to agree because I think it genuinely will alter the way that we conceptualize and discuss Islamic art, and also, stepping outside of the discipline for a moment, I think it's actually a project, this sort of attempt at inclusion and flexibility and sort of accounting for multiple ontologies that exist at the same time within Islamic selfhood is itself a project that's very dear to me personally, as you might imagine, having heard my range of interests. So I was also pleased to find a thinker so deeply and very sincerely engaged with these questions, and he's also clearly engaged on a personal level as well. And I was also impressed with the creativity that he exemplifies in some of his solutions. I suppose what might perhaps qualify me to talk about Islamic art is that I was briefly a curator of Islamic art at the Museum of Islamic Art in Qatar, where I often had to give tours and lectures to a general audience. It's a Muslim country, the audiences that I was speaking to and introducing objects to objects such as the infamous wine cup were themselves this demographic that we've been referring to as ordinary Muslims. So talking to a general audience who don't have a scholarly background, they don't have the theoretical apparatus, and trying to tell them that this is Islamic art was a very interesting process. And so grappling with these questions in real time and sort of giving and responding. I'm just going to get some water. Was really very eye-opening in terms of the way that the sort of reductive scripturalist approach to defining Islam has affected the way that ordinary Muslims, perhaps I can include myself in that group, look at and conceptualize objects such as these. So there will be sort of two threads that run throughout my paper. One is the actual implications for the discipline of Islamic art and Islamic aesthetics. The other one will be actually just for Islamic selfhood and this group that I think Dr. Shuruk Naguib described as the sort of ummah of Islamic scholars who are engaging with these questions. Actually, what does this book mean for us, mean for the constitution of Islamic subjectivity within the context of academia? And I think what Humaira said as well about decolonizing modes of knowledge production and actually using modes of Islamic knowing and conceptualizing to conceptualize this exact subject matter. So that's what I'll attempt to do in 15 minutes. The book is forthcoming, but my talk was easily an hour long, so this is going to be a bit of a struggle. So what I've tried to do is distill what he says, what Shahab Ahmed says about Islamic art through his 600 pages, and then give a bit of a critique and a response to that. So just to briefly go through, I feel that his discussion of Islamic art revolves around two sort of poles, aqtab, if you will, qutbain. One is the object, or the question of the mundaneness of objects, and he engages with Oleg Grabar's work on objects and Islamic art as being primarily decorative and mundane and serving really a decorative purpose. And the other question, the much bigger question, is that of the figural in Islamic art. And I also want to go back to the image that was discussed at the beginning of the day that gives a very nice spatial hierarchy that I think illustrates his conceptual framework quite well. So at the first chapter, he introduces a number of questions about Islamic art, engaging with the work of well-known Islamic art historians such as Finbar Barry-Flood, Sheila Blair, Jonathan Bloom, Oleg Grabar, basically asking, what is Islamic about these works of art? What is Islamic about a wine cup? These are questions that we've heard again and again. What is Islamic about figural art? What is Islamic about a painting such as this one, which not only is figural, but also depicts wine drinking? How do we describe that as Islamic? And these are the questions that he opens with, and I'm paraphrasing because I don't have much time. These are the questions that he opens with, and over the course of his book lays out his grand conceptual framework and then seeks to answer them in the 6th chapter. So in addition to engaging with this question of how are objects Islamic per se, how is figural art Islamic, he opens the discussion of figural art with the quotation from the Qanun al-Sur, which you mentioned, so I won't re-quote it, but he basically suggests that the figural form is a conduit to meaning. And so the surah and the ma'na, which you mentioned, is something that comes up again and again throughout his discussion of the importance of the figural. He also begins to harness the Sufism of Ibn Arabi as well as the illuminationism of As-Suhrawardi in this chapter. And he mentions tropes or ideas such as Ibn Arabi conceptualizing idol worship itself as a form of worshipping God. So using an image to reach truth, and how that's basically the same exercise. So he begins constructing this conceptual framework around the idea of the figure giving access or as a conduit to meaning and truth. And one thing that I haven't yet heard anyone talk about today that features again and again in his work, in this book, is this question of the seen and the unseen world, and the empirical as being part of the unseen, the empirical as part of the seen world, and as that sort of construct of the empirical and the seen as what we can consider to be a valid source of knowledge being something that we sort of need to move beyond. And I think that this ties very nicely into his discussion of figural art, in the sense that the figure is something that we actually move beyond to have access to some sort of abstract or spiritual or unseen meaning. And this picture, or this image, sums that up very nicely. So, these are the questions that he introduces at the very beginning of his work. He begins to articulate this theory of Islamic art as an instrument that can serve as a metaphor and a bridge between the seen and the unseen world, extending these arguments about form as a conduit to meaning. He also lays out conceptual issues surrounding the definition of Islamic in these seemingly problematic aspects of Islamic art production. I particularly appreciated his attention to Akbarian Sufism, to Sohrawardi, to paradox and contradiction predicated on knowledge of the scripture. In order to understand the paradox, you have to understand the scripture in order to be able to appreciate the ghazals of Hafiz and Bulleh Shah and Ghalib and Ibn. So I appreciate his introduction of the poetic, as well as the South Asian poetic forms that also harness many of these same contradictions and paradoxes. So I also like the Kaj Kulahi, the irreverent elegance, as a means of interacting with the divine. So those are the issues that he sets out in the first chapter. The questions he asks are those that are quite central to Islamic art history. Basically, how is this Islamic? What makes it Islamic? What makes a wine cup Islamic? What role does figural art play? And then Islamic art appears only once or twice explicitly in the intervening chapters, the sort of chapters 2 to 5, where he lays out his conceptual framework. They come up once in Hamid Dabashi's, he sort of engages with Hamid Dabashi's thoughts on art and adab, and argues against this sort of profane religious distinction, using Fazlur Rahman's arguments on the imagination to blur or erase the distinction between the secular or the religious. And those of you who've read the book, I won't go over these arguments again, but he basically draws on the idea of prophetic imagination as being, and I can just quote, the imagination is neither of the purely sensible nor of the purely intelligible, rather it is the link between the worldly and the otherworldly. It is both at once. So what I appreciate about, I think, beyond the hermeneutics of what he's trying to do, beyond the conceptual framework, I like the fact that he's trying to reintroduce the imaginative and the unseen into the productive and creative construction of the self, basically, and of the world that we inhabit, of the human experience of Islam, which is in many ways what he is concerned with. So after his critique of Hamid Dabashi, he also mentions Robert Irwin's use of Wittgenstein and his idea of a family of characteristics to conceptualize what Islamic civilization is, and he critiques that a bit from the standpoint that it doesn't involve causality, whereas he posits that actually there is causality in between the different elements that one can identify as being part of Islam, or what is Islamic. And it's after that point that he lays out, it's in the chapter after that he lays out his famous pretext, text, and context structure within which we can then begin to conceptualize things like the figural within Islamic art. So I think this question, so for me, his critique of Hamid Dabashi's secularist interpretation of art and adab, and or of his critique of the drawing of a distinction between the profane and the sacred, actually sums up the importance of the book for me, which extends beyond the academic discipline of Islamic studies. So I'm just going to quote a bit from his work here. So I think the true impact of the definition of Islamic that he is proposing is important for Muslims engaged in a process of intellectual self-formation in the context of modernity. And I agree that, yes, this is a very modern project. It is. It couldn't exist without, in response and in conversation to Wahhabism or Salafism, it couldn't exist if not for modernity. So yes, while there is a great deal of nostalgia for the pre-modern, it's a sort of creative reharnessing of what I see as a very rich world of possibilities and contradictions and paradox. Yes, they're only paradoxes within the context of the modern, but still they're worth reharnessing. And from what I've understood, that is his project. So I'll quote from him. It is not just the modern Western analyst who has difficulty conceptualizing historical Islam in terms other than those of the normative modern, Also, modern Muslims, in the respective degrees to which they are subjects or subject agents of the regimes of the modern, have the same conceptual difficulty. To the extent to which they are constrained to think in terms of the religious secular binary, modern Muslims have the altogether greater existential problem of living in terms of a conceptual incoherence with their past. I venture that a great deal of the existential tension in modern societies of Muslims arises precisely from the inability of modern Muslims to come to coherent terms with the norms of historical Islam, to come to terms with the constitution and meaning of their past, and from the incoherences of the various attempts to address this incoherence. And I'm assuming that's a play on the tahafut of tahafut, which I also really appreciate, so I thought it's worth quoting. But I think, to me, beyond the disciplinary considerations, this is one very important strand that runs through his work and is very creative and productive. And just on a personal level, because my experience of conceptualizing Islamic art history occurred in an Islamic context, I witnessed this conceptual incoherence firsthand, and the need to I wouldn't say resolve it, but at least come up with a set of terms or a structure that allows us to begin to articulate how to grapple with these problems is something that is in part addressed in his work. So that takes us to the 6th chapter, where he begins to resolve the questions surrounding figural art and Islamic art that he lays out in the 1st chapter. My favorite aspect of chapter 6 is not just that he begins to resolve these questions using this vast, sprawling, at times itself contradictory conceptual framework. And one thing that we haven't touched on yet is the actual spatiality of the framework that I hope I'm going to talk about here. What I like about this concluding chapter, and I think is a brilliant, brilliant move, is he doesn't explain Islam, he doesn't explain the figure through Islam. He allows the figure to explain Islam. He allows the image he actually uses the figural art itself to explain elements of the conceptual framework that he's been laying out over the course of the 600 pages. So I thought that was a really brilliant and very, very creative methodological move. And if you have a look at the 6th chapter, each point he addresses is illustrated it's illustrated by a particular work of art. And for me, the one that is most relevant to Islamic art, I thought, is this one, which we saw at the beginning of the day as an example of actually, I think, how he fails to properly conceptualize the pretext. But I disagree with that, actually. I think my interpretation of his interpretation of the pretext is quite different, so I'll go into that in a moment. So in this chapter 6, he turns the question that he asked at the beginning of the book, which is, what is Islamic about Islamic art? He changes it to say, what does the art object mean in terms of Islam? And thus, how does it mean? And this is something that is very important, because this is something I talk about in this paper, but didn't have a great deal of time to go into here. A lot of the art historical discipline, Islamic art historical discipline, is engaged primarily in very empirical investigations of court production, art as legitimation of power, art within, the elite production. It doesn't actually, not a great deal of it, only 1 or 2 art historians are actually looking at the meaning of the artworks themselves for the viewers of the artworks. It's very rare to actually find that level of meaning and interpretation. And so that's what he begins to get at in this 6th chapter. And again, there's a beautiful parallel between his discussion of the figure as a conduit, the form, the surah leading you to ma'ana, and his discussion of figural art. They run in parallel very nicely, I think, and reflect each other. So going back to the text, in the 6th chapter, he revisits Oleg Grabar's understanding of Islamic art as an art of the object, by which he means mundane objects. And he says that, and his response to this is that the Islamic art of the object is an art of mood or affect, indeed an art of consciousness. Its daily use is the altering and orienting of consciousness towards an ongoing state of the meaningfulness in everyday life. So I'll go back in my critique to how effective I think this analysis is, but he does return to the question of objects and try to situate them in relationship to the pretext, text, and context. I'm not sure he does it entirely successfully, but he does try. I was going to talk a bit about Humayun, which is a work that Robert Irwin, I think, in the introduction to one of the volumes of the sort of Cambridge Introduction to Islamic Civilization, he says that it's difficult to understand how this is an Islamic work of art, and then Shahab Ahmed responds to that, establishing quite definitively that it is an Islamic work of art. But I'll pass over that discussion because how much time do I have?
Probably about
4 or 5 minutes.
max.
Okay,
And that's
okay.
Already,
That's already generous. Okay.
I could listen to you all evening.
Thank you. I've got easily an hour of this. If you're so I'll return to this image, which to me was very meaningful. As I mentioned, one thing that hasn't yet been addressed is the spatiality of the conceptual framework that he constructs, which is very beautifully illustrated through this painting. I thought that his interpretation of this was genius. Just responding a bit to some of the earlier papers, my understanding of the pretext was not so much that it's actually a chronological, like a chronological precedent to the text of the Quran and the Hadith, or as sort of external to the text, but rather is conceived of as what poets, Sufis, artists, philosophers, or Muslims imagine to be the eternal truth that is expressed by the revelation of the text. So it's not actually a pretext. It doesn't actually exist prior to the text. There's no reality to it. It's an imaginative construct that allows him to include a range of forms of poetic or artistic production under within his conceptual framework of Islam. So that's my interpretation. I'm sure we can discuss that in the questions. But that being said, I'll go back and quote a bit of Shahab Ahmed's words on this painting itself. So, an example of a masterpiece of Islamic art that encapsulates and quite literally frames the process of meaning making by hermeneutical engagement with full spatiality of revelation, as expressed in hierarchy and exteriority, interiority, with the concomitant relationship of metaphor and paradox between the sameness difference of the truth and meaning diffused through daily life in the seen world and the unseen world, and as apprehended by the discursive and praxial activity of the explorative human imagination, is the famous miniature painting produced in Herat for the Safavid court around 1526 by the Iraqi master Sultan Muhammad, to illustrate others by Hafez. So we've already gone through the spatiality of it, that you have sort of at the bottom wine drinking that is actually really wine drinking. Then as you move up the hierarchy, wine drinking that is more of an intellectual illuminating activity. And at the very top you have the unseen world, where wine drinking is actually a realization of the truth, wine with a capital W, as he explains it in the text. So the spatial hierarchy of the image, the wine that is diffused through the painting, and its meaning that changes as the viewer's gaze moves through the space of the painting, the hierarchical space of the painting, which also echoes his support of hierarchy as something that should, intellectual hierarchy, as something that should be re-embraced. So the spatial hierarchy of the image, the wine that is diffused through the painting, and its meaning that changes as the viewer's gaze travels through the space, illustrates the axiom, and I'm quoting from him, "Al-majaz qantarat al-haqiqa," metaphor is the bridge of real truth. So this is what I think is quite valuable about his contribution to the understanding of Islamic art, is that he sees it as metaphor, as form and meaning, as a way of form to convey meaning. So the painting seems, so he sums up very nicely, the painting itself is a perfectly paradoxical answer to the question, what is Islam? And I very much like the fact that he uses the figural and to illustrate and bring together all of the many complex elements of his conceptual framework that he's been laying out over the course of the book. So just a very quick critique, if I have 1 minute. I'll limit my critique to the text to just a few small points. I'm really very pleased with the project as a whole, on a personal as well as a professional and intellectual level. I agree gender is something that he doesn't address, and gender as a form of meaning-making within the Islamic world is something that I feel should have been present in this, especially if you're talking about art and poetry and wine drinking. His conceptualization of Islam doesn't resolve every issue in defining what is Islamic about Islamic art. In fact, I think that the attempt to address the Islamicness of the objects, the mundane objects that are considered within the canon of Islamic art, struggles to situate itself within his own conceptual framework. I think his framework works best for when you have a linguistic or visual text or narrative for an object, it becomes very difficult to narrativize an object in relation to the pretext, text, or context. Context, perhaps, but again, it's very difficult to create meaning. He says that the beautification of daily life lends a certain aestheticizing affect to the experience of Muslims, but I'm not sure if that constitutes meaning or the making of meaning. But so I think it falls down for that element of Islamic art. However, I think that his conceptualization does resolve some of the thornier issues of terminology within Islamic art. Namely, he demonstrates the distinction between the secular and religious, sacred and profane, is a meaningless one within his conceptualization, which allows us to include images that are clearly Islamic to a viewer steeped in the poetical paradoxes and imagery of Hafez, Amir Khusro, or Ghalib, but perhaps not to researchers who are trained within the empirical discipline of Islamic art history, if you see what I mean, who've taken a more formalist approach to identifying Islamic art. So what he does is he applies meaning to form, echoing again many of the themes that he has explored throughout his work. I would also say that much of the research in Islamic art history is entrenched in the religious-secular divide. Many of the explanatory paradigms for objects and images produced in the Islamic world focus on questions of patronage, power, and legitimacy, as I mentioned before, rather than on meaning, philosophy, or even the aesthetics of the art. So I hope that Shahab Ahmed's work can inspire a conceptual turn within the discipline toward making meaning of the art and the philosophy surrounding it. That is to say, I hope that Islamic art historians start to answer his question, what does art mean in terms of Islam, and how does it mean? Because these are questions that are not often answered within the discipline. So, beyond the question of disciplinary considerations, it's a very important book. I will conclude with a brief quote from the Urdu short story writer Intizar Hussain, who, just to demonstrate that Shahab Ahmed is not the only person concerned about the impoverishment of the thought worlds of the colonial conscript in the Islamic world, as he puts it. Others echo similar sentiments in a different medium altogether, in this case fiction. So Intizar Hussain's translator describes him as trying to construct or reconstruct a larger civilizational space from which to derive imaginative strength through his writings, and creating an internal cosmology of language, symbol, and meaning in which to cultivate his writings. He's talking about Intizar Hussein's short stories in Urdu. In which to cultivate his writing, his self-formation, his imagination and creativity. So Intizar Hussain is quoted as echoing the sentiments of countless migrants during partition. He says, "I still feel that I'm an exile who wanders between Karbala and Ayodhya." I should add that this Ayodhya is not a real place on some political map, but the utopian kingdom of Rama, where an examined life of truth and moral law alone can confirm God's presence. His Karbala is not the present city with a specific geographical location, but a richly imagined site where the traditions of the Prophet give life a coherence, a reason, and a balance. So Intizar Hussein's parallel project of creating this abstract internal civilizational microcosm or macrocosm expressed through his fiction, and making sense of the world through engagement with the wider Islamic episteme. And a word that hasn't yet come up is cosmopolitanism, which I'm quite surprised about. So through engagement with the wider Islamic episteme, which in the South Asian Islamic context includes Buddhism and Hinduism, this echoes some objects of reviving, and if the audience will permit me, it echoes some of the nostalgia that Shahab Ahmed has for the pre-modern world of wonder, perplexity, and richness that we find woven throughout his text. So this project and its resonance in other works of art and poetry has given me a great deal of inspiration for a creative reformulation, both of art disciplinary definitions, as well as for reconstructing an imaginative selfhood of being Islamic.
A wonderful way of finishing the formal part of presentations. May I invite our speakers of this panel just to sit here? I think that's the convention. And while they're gathering, just to remind you all, when we finish our discussion, we'll move out to a reception which will include both wine and water, and other options perhaps. And also, I believe, an opportunity to buy the book at a reduced price, yes, which seems appropriate after you've been here all day. So there's that as well. But such three fascinating contributions. I'm sure there'll be questions
And I know that Chris Moffat has a question about possible because I saw it pop up. Okay.
But I did want to kind of invite you about your comments where affect doesn't constitute meaning. Is that right? Is this a methodological problem or a conceptual one? Is it in how we think about affect and meaning, or is it?
I think he just doesn't go into enough detail in his. I just think he doesn't go into enough detail about. He doesn't bridge that gap between saying that basically if you have a look at the passage where he discusses objects and how they imbue daily life with a certain affect, he just leaves it at that. So he leaves it to the reader to kind of infer that through how that might constitute the making of meaning. I'm not saying it doesn't. I just didn't understand. I didn't make that conceptual leap myself. If you can make it, I would be very keen to hear. So. Yes, please. Oh, good.
So thank you, Nora, for your paper. Assuming the Islamic preceding discussions of pretext, could you clarify? Because I found how you described pretext to be more or less what I was identifying as well. So what were you
It
talking
would be
about?
purely my own interpretation of it, and that would be based on my own reading of his project. Based not so much on a sort of, I guess how to phrase it, not so much on a reading of how he defines it, but my understanding of it and how he uses the term is of the greater space that's used, of the sort of, I wish I had the text in front of me, but basically as he conceives of it as the sort of eternal truth that the text of the revelation is revealing, basically. So to me, that's not, maybe I'm being cynical, that's not a real thing, that's an imaginative construct. So it goes without saying, to me, again in my interpretation, that an imaginative construct, at that point, whether it refers to the text that supposedly goes after it or doesn't go after it, is immaterial. Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I understood you to be saying it's fundamentally the pretext is his cipher for the Sufi vision of things, which we find represented in that.
It's a cipher for a lot of things. I think for the universe, for the cosmos, for logic, for everything that can be easily derived from the text of, say, the Quran or fiqh.
Well, that's, there you just said it.
Yes.
Can't easily be derived from. But you can claim that that is very easily derived from the Quran.
Oh, yeah, I think you can. In real terms, in actual terms, yes, absolutely. The text of the Quran, really, in empirical historical terms, comes before everything that he is saying is pretext. But in his framework, in his conceptual framework, he has to reverse the order. I think we're getting caught up on the pre, if you see what I mean. It doesn't, I don't think there's an actual chronological. There's no the temporality of it.
I don't think
it's beyond.
Yeah.
It's beyond. It's not pre.
Yeah.
On that note, I would want to pick on the terms. But as I was reading, Shahab Ahmed, I thought beyond would have been, especially given the spatiality, beyond in terms of the prefix meta, so text and meta-text, or the textual and meta-textual. Then you can, in a way, apply the term or the connective text in analytical terms and not make it value-laden as he does with the pretext.
Yes.
Because the pretext could easily slip into thinking of it as before or sopratext in terms of authority or because of the way he privileges the Sufi poetic. Exactly. So you could think of it as also privileging as above or something. But the meta is beyond, so it maintains the connection in a helpful way. And it's interesting that you mentioned the surah and the mana. The surah and the mana are really at the heart of scriptural hermeneutics from the 13th century onward. And scriptural hermeneutics, or acts of exegesis, engage very much with artistic acts, mostly poetic, but it's not excluded that the some certain images or artistic representations are also mentioned, for example, in Bursawi, when he refers to particular works of painting, places, and so on. So I think, yeah, the pretext as it exists, it doesn't do the thing for us. It doesn't help us understand the organic textuality of all these things together.
Yeah, I think it's the term that's tripping us up in a way, isn't it?
Okay, we're going to have you because to this, right? You wanted to say something to this?
Yeah,
Please join in. Then it's you.
I'm sorry.
No. Please do.
No, I think the notion.
I'm not sure this works actually.
Uh,
It does.
yeah, I understand how this pretext or beyond text, let's call it beyond text, it's a little bit difficult to grasp, but I think it's essential. First of all, it's essential in terms of metaphysics in general, but it's essential for the argument of Shahab because, for example, in one instance, it describes how, because it doesn't neglect the commoners, but how people who are not necessarily literate or can enter or engage with speculative discourse and text, do not read, they nevertheless engage with the revelation in terms of affect, in terms of emotion, of personal quest, spiritual quest, without having the intellectual means or the education for this. And in Sufi gatherings and through bodily activities, through dhikrs, through different means, there is a connection between this human experience and beyond text, beyond the discourses. They reach this entity that they love, through emotion and affect, which is the beyond text, which is God, basically, in the case of an Islamic system defined by the Islamic faith. But it could be in the case of a person who is an agnostic or a person who has atheistic tendency, even though born into a Muslim milieu. There is this beyond text. This person can say, I don't know what it is. Some call them God, some call this beyond text God or the divine. It doesn't exist, so a negation of this beyond text, but it is an essential concept in faith in general, but also for the argument about Sufis in particular, the importance of Sufis as a way for commoners who don't have access and the means of engagement through speculative discourses or textual discourses to be close to God or to live their piety or to live their Muslim life. But it's also an essential in philosophy, in pure philosophy, in phenomenology as well. It's an essential concept. It's the beyond, it's the ungraspable, the unfathomable, the unintangible, the unseen, and so on and so on. And in art is essential. For example, you have a form of art that deals with that is ornament. Ornament is pure materiality. Ornament doesn't tell you anything. I'm talking about the ornament without calligraphy. This ornament that you find on the facade of the Great Mosque of Damascus, these trees, these things, ornament. They can become completely abstract or vegetal, or it has different forms. This ornament doesn't tell you anything. It's a space, it's a material space. But when you encounter, you the beholder, Muslim or not, you have this material experience that awakes you some form of spirituality, some form of access. It gives you access, or it puts you in a state of hyper-perception that, or in a mental state that allows you to think about, believe or not, about this beyond text, about this thing, the mystery of existence, the mystery of the world. It's an essential concept, and in particular in art. So I'm here.
It's really interesting. You were going to say, and then it's
Hello, thank you. Perhaps a way of thinking about the pretext is also recognizing that it's a pun. So it's the pretext, as well as the pretext. And that leads me to thinking about the literary qualities of the book, which are extraordinary in many ways. I mean, from the subtitle, it's Wildian allusion to the epithets that he uses, repeated almost as if it's some sort of an epic poem. The Bengal to Balkans to Bengal complex, the italicizations, the placing of himself almost as a character within the book. So for me, it felt more sometimes reading it like it was a modernist novel, and we had Shahab Ahmed, the author, and there was Shahab Ahmed, the figure, almost like the authorial figure within there. He appears in footnotes boasting about his linguistic abilities, and you can see him as a sort of a figure who's absolutely considerable as they were, but it's a joke. And in the way of reading this book, it was mentioned earlier, Robert Fleet mentioned it as a sort of a work of art, and I wonder whether, with all the excellent, fascinating, and academic discussions that we've had today, perhaps we're missing one of the appeal of this book, perhaps outside the academy, or for people who are ordinary Muslims who just read this, like myself, is that it reads as much like a spiritual autobiography, masquerading as an academic intervention. And I think the strength and appeal of this book will be to readers who perhaps aren't so concerned with whether things are called Islamic or not, but allows them a space to be both modern and Islamic in a way that they want to be at the same time. So reading this for me personally was a liberation. I read, I want to read it again after having read it once already, and I know other people as well. It's going to have a profound impact in opening up areas of discussion and discourse. Every page, you can spend your whole life trying to read through the footnotes and just searching and going on that same path as well. So
it's a bit like those calligraphic.
Exactly.
Not calligraphic. But that's why I thought that your contribution, the biographical contribution, really chimed with that. It all sort of made total sense. I didn't know personally, but I thought that contribution chimed with this sort of revelatory, confessional, and yet extremely academic. So that combination of the two. Now it's your turn.
Yeah. I was going to ask a question not about the pretext, so it's hard to change it, but just trying to say just a comment because I agree too. I mean, it's a tremendously enjoyable read, and I thought of it sort of 200 years from now as a sort of ego document or a self-narrative. There's something for anyone, people who knew Shahab, you could hear him, the humor as well. I mean, the constant humor and the rhythm. How is this really Islamic? Isn't it just boom, boom, boom? So I thought that I really, I think your comments really, for me, captured a long sense of being a reader of this as well. There is something very self-narrative about this text, which is why I enjoyed it as a reader, even as big as it was. My question was for Emily. I wanted to ask you. I mean, I was interested in what you had to say in terms of the view from the history of science. I just wondered if you could say a bit more. So I wonder, for example, if you could put what you said alongside contemporary approaches to people like Newton, or history of science in a Christian context. We would never think to call. Well, actually, I'm thinking now of Rob Iliff's recent book. The subtitle is Priest and it's Newton, sort of priest and something. But so could you say a bit more about how we would compare these very two different contexts?
Yes, well, sorry. I do apologize for my very flat-footed approach to this book. But that's what historians of science do. We lack a sense of art and metaphor, things that the rest of them. But yes, the book you mentioned is exactly an example. Could you maybe just
Really close to you.
right?
Or do you think you could? Wait, we may be able to enhance this as actually work. Yeah, apparently it does work really well.
Is this better?
Just closer, maybe closer.
I'll shout. Right. My point was that the field of the history of science, professional historians of science, has changed in its attitude to itself and to their previous work in history. There's been a great change in the last 25 years. Whereas they dealt with other earlier writers would take up the matter of the obvious sort of conflict between someone being an devout person and still writing something that is, in an abstract sense, what we would call science. About 25 years ago, this really changed abruptly.
And people say, well, this is foolish. But we are that this notion of a great conflict is really a historical fallacy, if you will, that was introduced into historiography. And it was introduced initially into European historiography, and then, of course, they trained historians who then look at the Middle East. And it's extremely difficult to get people to draw back from. Everybody just assumes, it's been there it's been over 200 years. We've all been taught that there is this great conflict between religion, any religion, and science. And now they very convincingly argue that simply is wrong, and that was being read in to the material. When you have an idea in your head, you read it in. It's amazing what you will see when you look at the material if you come at it with a preconceived notion. And in my view, Islam is an extremely good example where we haven't been willing to look at it of why there hasn't been a conflict. And that an individual can write on various topics. Now, admittedly, they will write on one topic in one piece and one topic on another. Very few people take on every topic. I don't like the book because they read it. But they, at least in the pre-modern, I'm not a modernist, so I won't address those issues at all. But in the pre-modern Islamic world, there is not a conflict. And the people move very happily between thinking about the different logical, physical, metaphysical problems. Just as if you think about it as an individual, this is one of the approaches that the modernists say, as an individual, every day, you are encountering different types of logical problems, different types of perceptual problems, or maybe not problem is the word, but you're constantly adjusting things. And that has always been the case. Now, what I found when I got to the end of this very fascinating book, and I have a great respect for everything he's tried to do in it, I was disappointed. I wanted him to tell me why this society that he is now describing is Islamic. Of course, he doesn't want to use the word Islamic, so but what makes it Islamic?
So you weren't convinced?
I'm not.
By the ways he's tried to.
He didn't set out. You see, he didn't approach it asking the question like this. He seems unaware that historians of science have a different view. And he only cited one recent example, and that was only a particular author's side issue. He accepted, he took as a given that everyone thinks there is a divide, conflict between science and religion. He took that as a given. And all I'm trying to say is that modern or recent, very recent historians don't take that as a given. They say, stop and look. We've made a mistake. You can look at virtually all the societies. And that's not the given. And he was writing this, apparently unaware of that. And I would love to know what his answer would be if he had just a quote came out.
Vera, is it about this? No, so I'm going to have to go to Rob first, okay? Rob, you have a powerful voice.
Oh.
In every way, yes.
Not sure how to say that, but yes, okay. And there was the thing which I suppose struck me about the discussion on pretext is that the point of the pretext, as far as I understand it, is that the pretext exists and the text can change and be different, and it doesn't make any difference to the pretext. The pretext is the same, and the text can change. So it could be Quran, or you could change the Quran, but the pretext would be the same. And the pretext is a sort of like a constant, unchanging thing, which is why he identifies it with the apple of the philosophers. So I think that if that's going to be the framework in which we do it, I'd be interested to know to an extent, the different local manifestations that you find described in the book are only given validity or credibility because they're Islamic. So there's no space, if you like, for an un-Islamic local practice. Everything, do you see what I mean? There's no, which is in a sense a bit dictatorial, I find. In the methodological approach is a bit dictatorial. Everything has to be Islamic, and there's no local practice which can escape Islam. And it's sort of, that's a fear of localism in some way, is that it's all got to be subsumed into this Balkans to being world complex, and there's nothing which can fall outside it. And I think for art history or for science or for cultural activities such as wine drinking, there may be elements, but I would like to leave the possibility that there are elements which are un-Islamic.
I was just wondering about areas where there's really strong interaction with other religious traditions in the form of minorities, etc., which isn't dealt with systematically, which would be really interesting. But can we gather just a few thoughts here, and maybe then our panelists will answer all together? Amira, did you? Yes, you spoke.
Well,
Yes. Yes,
so
please.
I had a question for Professor Kennedy, but I'll phrase it so that I'm partly also addressing what Rob has raised. Because I read the pretext. I mean, first of all, I read the pretext argument as not being chronological at all, and actually being about beyond text, but beyond text in the sense of questions that are somewhat perennial, but they are bound to the text. They are, nevertheless, they do have a relationship with the text because they use at least some of the language or the phrasing or ideas from the text. So when I think of, and so the question that you raised, Rob, is very valid, which is anything outside of the Islamic in this conception? And I think of the Islamic in Shahab's conception as modernity. So when we say, this is in modernity this X, Y, Z happens, Europe is modern, for instance. When Europe is modern, there are many pre-modern institutions, there are many pre-modern ideas, there are pre-modern practices that circulate within modern Europe. But yet they are modern, right? That's because the framework, the overarching framework is set by modernity. So in that sense, there may be un-Islamic practices, there's no doubt about that, but if they are being practiced within an overarching framework of reference, however tenuous, to the text ultimately, even if it is as beyond text. So maybe I'm just trying to work through Shahab's articulation here and trying to work with this idea. So for instance, when I was listening to Professor Kennedy, I was thinking about the fact that, we can't walk away with the idea that wine drinking was only a courtly experience and activity. But we do know, for instance, in the South Asian context, that wine drinking was a feature of various festivals at saints, at the various old sand, various kinds of saints, shrines, etc. as well. Wine, some amount of, mild drugs, etc. That was and continues to be part of that kind of spiritual experience. Now, it's outside of the normative, prescribed framework of Islamic practice, and yet it is part of Islamic practice, and it is validated by, in these specific sites, in these shrines. It's not, maybe if you're a middle class household, it's not entirely an Islamic practice, but if you're at a shrine, it is an Islamic practice, because this is one way to get to the divine, one way in which getting to the divine has been prescribed and understood. So the same practice is Islamic and un-Islamic at the same time. As I was saying, the same person is a scientist and a theologian at the same time. So I think that the way I read Shahab's argument then is that it is Islamic, and at the same time it can be something else. We know Islamic is one of the important identities, but it doesn't have to be the only or the primary identity. So I just wanted to say, is that wine drinking
a couple of points about that. The first, I think, is that, as I understand it, Ahmad would argue that because these people are doing it, it's happening at this Muslim court and it is being performed by these people who are very consciously putting themselves forward as champions of Islam, and of Sunni Islam in particular, in this context. That, by definition, makes it an Islamic practice. I mean, rather than saying, there is an Islamic practice and there are other non-Islamic, because they're doing it, and because they're saying this is what we're doing, it becomes an Islamic practice. It may be a different sort of Islamic practice from other sorts of Islamic practice, but it's still fundamentally an Islamic practice. And the second point is, of course, the drinking that's going on at Islamic court is not about seeking enlightenment. Or it doesn't have any spiritual pretext. It's going because that's what great rulers do. Great warriors do it. They hold their drink better than anybody else, and it's part of being a great king. And it goes back to well into pre-Islamic times, how great kings present themselves and so on. And feasts and drinking sessions with their courtiers, it goes right back to the kingly times and so on. It's a very well established pattern. And that's what they're inheriting this idea. This is how do you perform monarchy? How do you be a great king? One of the ways to be a great king is having great kingly parties. And that's it. So, I take your point about sometimes, in some ways, the use of wine by what we might loosely call Sufi practices, but that's slightly different from the royal use of wine.
And yet both are Islamic.
The last question has to come from there, I think.
I'm trying to agree with Mary's point, the fact that to simplify something simply to Islamic and un-Islamic, I mean, as a historian, that proves to be quite problematic in the sense where what you're doing, you are, at the very essence, you're dumbing down to everything to be either Islamic or un-Islamic, and all the other factors are being completely removed. I mean, if we were to take this kind of framework and say, oh, the only reason that the king was drinking was to show, was the act of drinking itself Islamic, in a way you're removing all kinds of cultural norms, and you say, well, that's Islamic, so that's Islamic. You're just kind of standing the kind of Islamic on every single thing, and that just kind of removes all the other factors that we can take into consideration. So, how valid is kind of thought process as a historian?
Well, that's exactly what Emily was challenging, wasn't it? Anybody want to say something finally about the issue of Islamic? Or do you want to say something to that? But we'll then have to really finish with.
I wanted to make a comment and sort of continue on.
We can't hear you.
Sorry.
Speak really loudly.
I wanted to make a comment or ask a question, continuing from this point about wine drinking. I'm wondering how, as modern people, are we imposing the notion of Islamic on things that might not have been considered by the people at the time as Islamic, especially within the context of court and wine drinking. I was in an undergraduate course with Professor Kennedy, and we studied the classical Arabic historians, and I remember we studied Ibn Jubayr, who went on his rihla because he wanted to repent for drinking, for having a sip of wine. So this idea of like perhaps the notion of what is Islamic was not Islamic, it was contested at the time. So as modern people, are we trying to impose this notion of Islam just so we can get this feeling that at that point of history was a solidly Islamic history?
Yes, I think the answer to your question is sometimes we are and sometimes we aren't. It's a discussion that does go on, and Jubair is right, so it decided on a hat because you talked a glass of wine. This is in Al-Andalus, of course, where maybe norms are different, but not. There's a problem with making generalizations, isn't it? And saying, well, in Islamic society, they did this, they did that. Well, some did, some didn't. Different societies in the same society at different times. I mean, you can trace the drinking practice of the Abbasids quite clearly. Those who do and those who don't. And it's well known, some do it, some don't. And some drink to excess and some just a little bit. you know, so forth. But it's all recorded, but there's no consistent pattern and even at that level, a generalisation doesn't work. So I think it's not that we're imposing modern things; it's we're tending to. There's a tendency to make generalisations of a sort of one sentence long sort that actually irons out a whole variety of different methods that we're really stuck
Thank you. What I took away was also, which hasn't been discussed here much, is this sort of social or emotional sense of what's Islamic is the desire to be, or the belief that you might be part of this enormous body of people out there. And it's like the two fathers-in-law getting together on the phone and sorting it out from the, you'll have to read that in the acknowledgements. I mean, but also later on, I mean, the notion that there can be saying, oh, this is obviously very dangerous because you can sort of mobilize a billion people around a single idea, but it's also extremely, it's universalizing, it takes people out of where they are, and it's sort of parochial, and it's perhaps related also to some notions of gospel. I'm not sure, yes, you raised that. And I found that very much also in sympathy with sort of the ways in which a lot of people who don't believe and don't observe nonetheless feel their Jewish heritage, for example. So there's a lot more to discuss, and I feel I obviously never met Shahab, as I said, but I have a feeling of being in a sort of presence. I don't want to get too spiritual about it, but and I think, as this gentleman here said, that this obviously will affect a lot of people, and conversations will follow. And I think we really have to thank Yossi very much for organizing this event.